General Motors is one of the biggest, most impactful automakers in the world. For well over a century now, they have been the company behind some of the biggest, most recognizable car brands, including Chevy, Buick, and Cadillac. It is likely one of those companies that is bigger than you realize, especially throughout their history. GM has been a Fortune 500 company every year since they started the list in 1955. Only about 50 others can say that, and to take it a step further, they have been at the top of the list more times than anyone else, meaning when ranked by revenue, GM was typically the biggest company in the United States until the year 2000. That is when they started falling down the list, currently sitting at number 21. Now, before you say anything, I realize that still makes them a giant multi-billion-dollar company. I am not trying to dispute that. However, I think almost anyone will agree with me when I say that GM has declined from where they once were in just about every way you want to look at it. Overall size, market share, public perception. In 2009, they filed for bankruptcy, reporting $82 billion in assets and twice as many liabilities, making it the fourth largest bankruptcy in the history of the country at the time. There is so much that could be said about General Motors. They have helped shape the automotive industry and arguably the entire country as we know it. For this video, I want to talk about some of the more notable parts of their history while highlighting what I believe to be 5 of the biggest reasons behind their decline. My first reason is competition. And keep in mind that most of these are going to be more broad, so I can keep the list down to only 5. But yeah, General Motors has dealt with increasing competition over the years. Consider that cars themselves were not even that popular yet when the company started in the early 1900s. William Durant had already built one of the world's biggest carriage companies, like the ones that would be pulled by horses. That was the popular mode of transportation at the time. Well, the Buick Motor Company separately was struggling, so Durant essentially took it over, formed General Motors, and used it as his entry into the emerging auto industry. He quickly acquired 25 other companies within a couple years, including Cadillac and what would later be renamed Pontiac and Oldsmobile. It was an aggressive strategy that unfortunately ended up backfiring. They had borrowed $15 million to buy those companies, making them vulnerable. A short downturn in the economy hurt car sales, and when they could not pay their debt, the bank gained control of the company and forced Durant to leave it. The twist here is that after he left, he teamed up with Louis Chevrolet to start the Chevrolet Company, used the profits he made there to acquire shares of General Motors, and was eventually able to take control of it and join the two companies together. However, a couple years later, he was forced out of it again after making a bunch of other acquisitions. But those are the unusual circumstances that led to Chevy and all these other car makers being under the control of one company. In the 1920s, they utilized that brand portfolio by positioning each one of them to appeal to a different segment of the market. You know, where Cadillacs are at the higher end, followed by the others. If you were looking to buy a car, GM would almost certainly have something to meet your specific criteria. In 1931, they became the biggest automaker in the world and continued to grow with the market. In the 1950s, when the economy was doing well, roads were being built all over the country, and car ownership was becoming the new standard, General Motors was the company benefiting from it more than any of the others. At their peak, around 1960, they controlled more than 50% of the US market. Think about what that means. More people were buying cars made by GM than all of the other makers combined. For so long, Ford and Chrysler had been the only real competition, but then the manufacturers from Japan, like Toyota, started making an impact. See, those US manufacturers were starting to form a negative reputation as far as quality. Most notably for GM, we could look at the Chevy Vega. It was promising at first, but quickly became a disaster when GM had to recall many of them in 1972 for multiple reasons. On top of that, the oil crisis the following year shifted consumers away from the muscle cars and bigger sizes that GM and the other US companies were focusing on and toward the more compact, fuel-efficient cars that were being imported from Japan. Japanese imports grew more than 10 times higher throughout the 1970s. GM even started their Saturn division to make more compact cars to better compete in that market, but they were already losing control of things. times. In 2008, it was big news when Toyota surpassed General Motors in total number of cars sold, meaning there was a new world leader for the first time in over 75 years. In 2021, Toyota even surpassed GM in US car sales briefly before GM reclaimed the title the following year. So they used to be the undisputed highest selling auto company in the world, and today they're struggling to hold on to that #1 spot in their home country. That 50% US market share has steadily fallen to a little under 20% at this point. The next reason on my list is labor costs. General Motors has paid so much money to their employees to a point where it has made it difficult for them to operate efficiently. The United Auto Workers have negotiated higher salaries and even gone on strike multiple times. The most impactful one lasted 67 days in 1970. At the time of the bankruptcy, the CEO of GM said that he believed agreeing to expensive union contracts was among GM's biggest mistakes. In the 1980s, when the Japanese automakers were winning over consumers, there was a quota in place limiting the number of cars that could be imported into the country from Japan. Well, that motivated them to establish factories in the US that were typically more efficient and filled with non-union workers that could produce cars at a considerably lower cost. GM had a major issue where they could not even keep up with paying employees that used to work for them. Remember, they used to have a lot of employees. I believe they were the biggest employer in the country at one point, with over 450,000 people working for them in the US. That, by the way, has since fallen by about 80%. In 2003, they had to issue $10 billion in bonds to cover pension costs. In 2005, they said that they were supporting 3.2 retirees for every active employee. And in 2007, they revealed that over the past 15 years, they had paid over $100 billion in pension and healthcare of legacy employees. Obviously, this is a topic that could be debated with opposing viewpoints. All I'm trying to say is that when that much money is going toward current and former labor, it is difficult to keep up with competitors who simply do not have those same expenses. For the next reason on my list, I'm going to say a lack of innovation. See, innovation is arguably one of the main reasons GM grew so large in the first place. In 1912, the Cadillac was the first commercially available car with an electric self-starter. Before that, you had to use a hand crank to start a car. Could you imagine if we still had that? In 1940, the Oldsmobile offered an option for the first fully automatic transmission. In 1973, an Oldsmobile had the first airbags in a commercially sold vehicle. Those are just a few, and being such a major manufacturing company, they even made advancements outside of the auto industry. For 60 years, they were the owners of the appliance company Frigidaire, selling 5% of all appliances in the US at one point. During World War II, they manufactured airplanes. In 1952, they made the first medical heart pump, which to my understanding made it possible to perform open heart surgery for the first time. In the 1960s, they made guidance systems for NASA that were used to get to the moon. In 1994, a division of GM was involved with satellites and actually started DirecTV. Despite all of these impressive efforts over the years, GM has been criticized for being complacent at times and slow to respond to consumer demand, either by resisting change because their current methods are more profitable in the short term, or by their inability to change quickly due to large, inefficient corporate structure. Specifically, when it comes to smaller cars, more fuel-efficient cars, and even hybrid or electric cars. Again, this can go off into a big tangent, but a simple example of the impact is in early 2008, gas prices went way up, and since GM had remained so reliant on the sale of SUVs and pickup trucks, their revenue fell so much that it put them in an especially vulnerable position when the recession worsened, leading me to my next reason, the recession. A lot of this one is fairly straightforward. With a slower economy, people don't have as much money to spend on big purchases like new cars. General Motors has a lot of fixed costs. They're paying for those factories and those pensions and a lot of other things, whether they are selling new cars or not. So their revenue fell quite a bit, while their expenses only dropped a little bit, meaning they started losing a lot of money. It was so much that they could not continue operating like that. They were already right in the middle of these big turnaround efforts, trying to address all of their other issues, and the drop in sales was like the final straw that was too much for them to handle. They started talking to Ford and Chrysler about potentially merging their operations because they were struggling as well, but in the end, the solution for GM proved to be much more controversial. They were saved by what was essentially a $50 billion bailout from the US government, where through the bankruptcy, they effectively acquired about 60% ownership of the company. From there, they trimmed down their operations, mostly by discontinuing major brands like Pontiac and Saturn, in an attempt to emerge as a slimmer, more efficient company that was more focused on their core brand brands and more able to respond to changes in the markets. The following year, they had the biggest initial public stock offering in US history, raising over $20 billion, and I have to say that the value of this company has been surprisingly unchanged ever since, meaning you would have made considerably more money investing in the overall markets. For my final reason behind the decline of GM, I'm just going to say their reputation. Another broad reason, I admit, but I think fitting because General Motors is one of those iconic American brands that has sadly given people so many potential reasons to dislike them as a consumer, as an employee, as an investor, even as a taxpayer. By the time the US government sold the last of those shares in 2013, they reported that they had lost over $11 billion from the bailout, which of course came from the taxpayers. That could be aggravating, right? They took your money and used it to save this company that clearly had made some poor decisions. The reasoning they had behind it was that they were too big to fail, and that GM shutting down would have a terrible impact on the economy. In the end, they estimate that saving GM saved about 1.2 million jobs. It becomes a part of a bigger political debate, but you can understand how that bailout could be upsetting to people. Also along these lines, there have been some safety concerns with the cars that they sell, a major one being in 2014, when they had to recall 2.7 million cars and trucks because of a faulty ignition switch that would just shut the car off while it was driving. Over 100 people died because of it, with many more injured, and investigations revealed that the company had known about the problem for over a decade but failed to address it in any major way. There was a big settlement in 2016, but a lot of people were unhappy with the lack of consequences that they had to face from it. I'm just trying to convey that GM's reputation is not nearly as strong as it used to be, and that has certainly not been helpful for a consumer car company like this. Let me know in the comments, what do you think about General Motors? Have you ever owned a vehicle made by them, and if so, how did it compare to other vehicles you may have owned? Or maybe you intentionally stay away from GM, and if that's the case, what is your reasoning? Again, I want to remind everyone that this is one of the biggest case studies ever, with over a century of history filled with impactful events. My intention with this video was simply to give an overview of the company and identify what I believe to be the biggest reasons behind their decline. If you have anything you think should be added to the list or anything interesting to say about GM that you think is worth saying, please do so. And any other thoughts you have about General Motors or the American auto industry in general, leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.